Good afternoon, everybody. If you are in Baltimore watching us, thanks for tuning in on this exceedingly wet afternoon. If you're not, and our guest today is not tuning in from Baltimore, but if you're not, I hope it's sunny wherever you are. My name is John Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we are back with one of our virtual history talks in partnership with the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. Thanks again to everybody who has hit that voluntary donation button. We really appreciate your support. Before I introduce today's speaker, just want to say next week we are going to be joined by Baltimore County historian Louis Diggs to talk about underground railroad sites in Baltimore County. So that should be pretty neat. And then the following Friday, we'll going to talk about all things Pratt Library main branch. So if you are a Pratt Library fan, or even if you're not, please tune in for that. So maybe that'll be a sunny day for those two. All right, Janet Marie Smith is luckily our speaker today. She has been all things Baltimore for years and years. I'm going to brag a tiny bit about you. Sorry, Janet Marie. But in addition to Baltimore, she has designed and been part of baseball parks in Atlanta and in Boston and now in Los Angeles. She, of course, was the, and I know there were other people involved, but she was the, with a capital T, brains behind Camden Yards when that was built. And in particular, I think when she came on board, the proposed baseball stadium called for demolishing the B&O railroad warehouses, which of course are such a signature part, not just of the ballpark, but of downtown and really of Baltimore. And so I think we owe a debt of gratitude to her for coming in exactly at the right time there. So I'm going to actually just stop bragging about you and say thanks for joining us, and we are all yours.
All righty. Well, I'm hoping that when it's time to share my slides, that I'm as agile with this as I want to be. But first, thanks for having me. It's validating to be asked to talk about Camden Yards almost 30 years after it opened. When I was working for the Baltimore Orioles to plan Camden Yards, I was often asked, how do you know this is going to stand the test of time? It seemed kind of crazy, I think, to some people that we were building a new building that was going to be deliberately old-fashioned with modern amenities, and we were mindful of the fact that Memorial Stadium on 33rd Street was only 34 years old. And the answer is you don't know. Like, no one has a crystal ball. You don't know if it's going to stand the test of time, but you try to plan for a building that has value beyond just baseball, that has value to the city. And so it made me feel great when I got the call to join you all today and talk about this and know that there's still widespread interest. So I'm going to take you through a slide presentation that I had put together to help illustrate some of the things that were important to us and to try and kind of make this feel like you are a part of understanding the challenges that we faced. Memorial Stadium, as I mentioned a moment ago, was opened in 1954. I think it was when the Orioles was renovated for the Orioles in 54, and was home to, I think, some unbelievable sporting events. And those of you who have been in Baltimore longer than I probably know them best. But the Colts had left town in part because, or largely because, Memorial Stadium no longer served their needs. They felt that it was it simply did not have either the player facilities or the kind of sponsorship or premium seat opportunities, suites, club seats, etc., that they were seeing in other new football venues. And after trying unsuccessfully to convince the state to build a new multi-purpose facility downtown, the Colts simply went to Indianapolis. So Larry Lucchino, who was then president of the Orioles, had, I think, a lot of leverage in looking at what should happen with baseball-only parks. And looking around the league, it was sort of striking that these multi-purpose venues that were then being discussed were all so ubiquitous. Whether you were looking at Pittsburgh, where you had Three Rivers Stadium that was home to baseball and football, or whether you were looking at other facilities in Philadelphia or Atlanta, they all kind of look the same. They had typically had some 65,000 seats, so they were really too big for baseball, not large enough for football. The seating configuration served neither team very well, and that they had been used, I think, to really create a rationale for the public sector to get involved in the stadium business, but one that did not last more than a generation. So looking around the league, it seemed kind of crazy to the Orioles that we would go this route in Maryland, especially with no football team to house the building. Instead, what Larry Lucchino pointed Governor William Donald Schaefer to was Kansas City. Kansas City had built a new baseball-only facility and a new football-only facility. And while they were in the suburbs and so had nothing to do with the urbanity of the city as Baltimore hoped to achieve with their park, nonetheless, they are an important precursor to Oriole Park at Camden Yards and the Ravens' new stadium, because they were a city that had built two new facilities, specifically one for football and one for baseball, so that the Royals play in a baseball-only facility of about 45,000 seats, and their football team plays in a building that's about 70,000 seats. The other thing that was really important to Larry, once he won this battle of having two facilities rather than one, was he had a mantra that he wanted to build a ballpark, not a stadium. And that was a hugely important, but subtle but hugely important nuance. Ballparks had character, stadiums didn't. That was something that he really just believed with his heart of hearts. And so much so that at the Orioles, there was sort of a joke, not a joke, that you get fined if you use the S word, if you called it a stadium. We were building a ballpark, and in the character of some of these early classic parks that I want to show you, this is Shibe Park in Philadelphia, and arguably before lights were added, if you didn't know it was a ballpark, you wouldn't know from this kind of architectural character, where it was designed to be something as handsome as a library or a city hall. Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, which is where Larry Lucchino had grown up, was an important model for us. Forbes not only had this wonderful architectural character to its facade, as did Fenway Park in Boston, but these ballparks also had character on the interior. Baseball is one of the few professional sports, I guess golf being the only other exception, where there is no set dimension to the outfield. The infield, 90 feet between the bases, 60 feet 6 inches from home plate to the mound, that's set. But the outfield can be most anything it wants to be. It's one of the things that makes baseball so interesting, I think, especially to urbanists, because often baseball takes on the character of the surrounding street and block plan. In Fenway Park, which opened in 1912, you can see that the Red Sox ran out of real estate down the left field line, and thus was born this high wall to compensate for that short distance, lovingly called the Green Monster these days. It has defined Red Sox baseball for over 100 years now. So it was this kind of character that we were looking to have at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, which is long gone by the time I started to work in baseball, still was it's still regarded today, looking back and studying photographs and postcards, as a building that had these kind of characteristics: a very handsome facade, a very well-behaved urban building with the streets, sidewalks, setbacks at the rooftop. And like Fenway, when Ebbets ran out of real estate down the right field line, not only did they create a wall, but like Forbes Field, there was a scoreboard in the field of play. And you can see from the configuration of these older parks that fans were right on top of the action. Unlike the multi-purpose stadiums where the round form pushed the seats some 60 feet beyond the baseline, even if you were in the front row, these parks, typically the front row was 35 to 40 feet behind home plate, and down the lines often even tighter rather than wider. And so these parks really created an energy so that from a fan perspective, it made it a place you wanted to be. Even if you weren't fielding a competitive team, or even if it wasn't opening day or the postseason, there was a chance that it was going to have this kind of energy and vibe that made a summer night really special. Now, Baltimore had something going for it. And I want to just burnish this point, not to leapfrog ahead to the punchline, but it always takes more than one genius to make something happen in a city. And I really feel that the stars were aligned when Mayor William Donald Schaefer, who had loved Baltimore with a passion and approached its redevelopment intuitively, looking for things that would bring people downtown, when he ended up as governor and in a position to shape what became Oriole Park at Camden Yards, and Larry Lucchino with his mantra of let's make it about the city, let's make it fit into the community, let's try to harken back to the characteristics of these older parks. The stars were really aligned. So Governor Schaefer, who had been the engineer behind adding the waterfront promenade, the aquarium, the science center, the convention center, and the light rail, is sort of famously said to have looked at all of the locations studied for the baseball and football complex and said, looking from Port Covington to Laurel to Baltimore, as I've heard the story, his bottom line was, I don't care what the study says, as long as it recommends downtown Baltimore. In his mind, we already had the infrastructure. Those photographs that I showed you of Kansas City are instructive because it may have resulted in a beautiful facility, but the city spent just as much money on the infrastructure and the roadways to get to it as they did on the building itself. Here in Baltimore, we already had parking that would accommodate 200,000 office workers a day. We were right next to the medical center. Where garages vacated largely at 5, leaving them available for baseball fans in the evenings. The light rail was under construction. The MARC train stopped 600 feet away from where home plate was planned. And so there was a rationale to dumping the 2 million fans a year that would come to Oriole games into downtown in order to facilitate the city's growth and add to this collection of attractions that today really define downtown Baltimore. The light rail itself, as I mentioned, was under construction, and I can't underscore enough how important this was to the Orioles in the early days. You have to remember that then Washington, D.C. did not have a football team, and almost a third of our audience was coming from the D.C. area. So having this commuter train and the light rail stop so conveniently really made a difference in terms of planning Camden Yards. We were able to plan this park with confidence with only 5,000 surface dedicated parking spaces for the 2 stadium complex. And that was significant at the time compared to what other cities were doing. So the resulting site really lent itself to the aspirations that both of these gentlemen had. The governor in terms of looking to help stabilize and grow downtown Baltimore, and the Orioles president, Larry Lucchino, looking to create this old-fashioned ballpark with modern amenities. Camden Station itself was preserved as a part of this, as was the B&O Warehouse. And you heard from John's a moment ago talking about how controversial it was. It's hard to believe, looking back at the debate from the perspective of time, that was even a topic of discussion, because indeed it is the warehouse that defines the postcard view for the Baltimore Orioles home. But it was debated because, as you can see in this photograph, Camden Yards is a very asymmetrical facility. That might have been something that Larry Lucchino had aspired to, but it was something everyone else lacked confidence was really going to be something that would stand the test of time. In order to save the warehouse, we had to do something asymmetrical. You could argue it both ways, that it gave us the opportunity to do something legit, or you could say that it forced us into do something warped. Back in 1989, the jury was still out on which would be the right lens through which to look at that. The Stadium Authority, who oversaw, owned, financed, and built this park, approached this with enthusiasm. And Herb Belgrad, who was the chairman of the Stadium Authority, and Bruce Hoffman, who was the executive director, thought if there's a will, there's a way, but it's got to be financially responsible. And so HOK, our architects, did studies to demonstrate that if we took uses like the Orioles, ushers' changing rooms, the offices, the central kitchen, and put those in the warehouse, that not only could the footprint for the new portion of the ballpark be smaller, but the cost of those spaces being renovated in the warehouse would be fewer dollars per square foot than the equivalent amount of square footage in the new stadium. So we were able to justify it not only emotionally and not only in terms of its image, but in terms of its economics. And indeed, it did as we hoped. It gave us a rationale for making Oriole Park at Camden Yards asymmetrical. One of the challenges that HOK faced was that in baseball, you typically put the third baseline due north in order to get the best sun conditions on the playing field. But by doing that, it meant that the conventional entrance of behind home plate was in the area that was furthest away from light rail, furthest away from downtown and the aforementioned parking garages. And so one of the challenges that we faced in saving the warehouse and in configuring the ballpark so that it had the best sun conditions is what were we going to do about the fact that the majority of our fans were going to be coming in the outfield. And I want to give a special nod to RTKL, who did the master plan, and David Murphy, who was our point person on that, because they, along with city planning and with Evans Paul, who was leading that effort for the city, really advocated that we find a way to make the back door feel like the front door. And so it's interesting to me how Utah Street, which ended up being this sort of wonderful concourse through the ballpark, came to define not only the dimensions of the playing field and the configuration of the seats, but in many respects, when you say, what should I do when I go to Camden Yards, every baseball fan will always say something about Utah Street and the energy there, whether it's the novelty of finding the bronze baseballs that mark the hundreds of home runs hit there, or whether it's the fun of still, after 30 years, finding Boog Powell, our former first baseman, out there barbecuing and signing autographs. There's something about that outfield experience that became a defining moment, not only for this building, for many that followed. So the other heroes in this ended up being our graphic designers as well. We brought in Ashton Design, who never worked on a sports venue, but was a local firm that really had an appreciation for the tradition that we were trying to achieve. And David Ashton himself worked very closely with Joe Spear, our architect at HOK Sport, to come up with a design for the scoreboard itself that would be memorable, that would act not only as a delivery mechanism for information to baseball fans, but in a moment I'll show you how it acts as a sign to invite you into Camden Yards as you approach from the north and from the traditional downtown. Much of the scale of this building was really artfully thought through by HOK with Joe Spear and Ben Barnett's leadership. They advocated for depressing the playing field 16 feet so that fans would walk in at street level. Half of them would walk down to their seats. The other half would walk up. It made for better circulation. It allowed for a more efficient construction. Less cost had to go into escalators, ramps, elevators. But it also gave us a scale that really responded not only to the B&O Warehouse that we were saving and to Camden Station that you see on the far left of this image, but also to the surrounding neighborhood. So Utah Street itself, coming through the ballpark, ended up being a real signature part of Oriole Park at Camden Yards, with this idea that on game days we would put up turnstiles and it would be a part of the concourse that's ticketed, and all of the food, beverage, and retail would be a part of the inside the park experience for Oriole fans. But on non-game days, those turnstiles would go away and you could just walk down Utah Street just like you can Baltimore's Inner Harbor Promenade. You could watch the grass grow. You kind of take in the fun of being at a ballpark, even on its quietest days. I love this image that the photographer Janice Ritagliato took very early on of this building. And I wanted to make a note about something that we worked very closely with HOK to achieve on the scale. I mentioned the reduction in the perceived height by depressing the playing field 16 feet. But one of the things that HOK and Joe Spear in particular worked really closely with Bliss Nitre, their structural engineer, to achieve was to set the upper deck back and make a conscious decision not to clad that in masonry, so that this building, even though it's 110 feet from the playing field to the last row of seats in the upper deck, the perceived height of the building from the street, the masonry portion, is only 55 feet high. And so it compares in scale with the row houses of Ridgely Delight and in a very favorable way, so that it doesn't overwhelm the residential neighborhood nearby that we were trying to preserve. I mentioned the back of the scoreboard being the front of the scoreboard, and this is the image I wanted to share to illustrate that to you. We made a conscious decision not to have a traditional museum with objects under glass, but rather to celebrate the Orioles' history with pieces of memorabilia that would be littered throughout the ballpark that would tell a story about the Orioles. And so David Ashton's office crafted these beautifully sculptured retired numbers that are outside the gates that you can go and have photographed just any old day. You can see that the scoreboard itself is this Andy Warhol styled Coca-Cola bottle that welcomed you from 10 blocks to the north as you walk down Utah Street to enter Oriole Park. You can see from some of these photographs the attention that was given to detail. And this was something the Orioles really advocated. When you've got 81 games a year and they're each an average of 3 hours long, there's a lot of time to just take in the atmosphere. And we wanted everything to tell a story, not just be beautifully designed, but to tell a story. So we chose to use this 1890s Orioles logo on the seat-in standard. You can see the emblem forms the acronym Baltimore Baseball Club. We found this in research in James Brady's book, The Hometown Team, about Orioles history. Triangle Sign worked with us very closely to design the top of the scoreboard. David Ashton used the same BCB as bookends for the sign itself. We borrowed liberally from the Bromo Seltzer Tower and chose, instead of saying 1 through 12 on the clock, spelling out Baltimore Sun, our local sponsor. The sun itself, the H and the E light up to denote a hit or an era in the game. So that the sign itself and our sponsor tells a story about the game. Last but not least, the Oriole wind vanes are always showing how the wind is pointing, and you might look at this photograph and think, wow, that's crazy. If they're wind vanes, wouldn't they be going the same direction? But it's evidence that the wind kicks off of the warehouse in a very different form than it does coming in from the west. So again, just another little fun fact about the game, and something that you can just enjoy for the beauty of the scoreboard, or you can see how many stories this piece tells. I'm not going to take the time I have to tell you every story, but again, just sort of the idea of the gates and the Orioles birds, and using the Orioles Hall of Fame to tell a story along Utah Street. Again, Utah Street is open every day, whether there's a game or not. So you can walk out there after lunch today if it stops raining and take in these Oriole Hall of Fame plaques. We started a tradition of noting home runs that were hit out onto Utah Street, and that has continued. So there's several hundred out there now that are there to be found. I should give a nod to Frank Robinson, our Orioles manager, who was actively involved in setting the field dimensions for Camden Yards. Frank was a big advocate for making certain that the warehouse was positioned so that you wouldn't hit it every day, but you might hit it every now and again. And he turned out to just be such a fantastic foreseer of things, because in all the years that Camden Yards has been open, there's only been one baseball that's hit the warehouse, where there have been several hundred that have landed on Utah Street. So it's really nice to think about these traditions, and who would have ever known that this idea of asking Boog to go out and barbecue some chicken would have turned into the institution that it has. But here at the 29th year, Boog himself is still out there barbecuing, and this is still very much a fixture of Oriole Park at Camden Yards. Larry Lucchino asked us to seek input from fans, and maybe one of the best ideas we got from fans was this notion of elevating the bullpens beyond the outfield fence so that you could see who was warming up for either team. You can see the standing room beyond that and the picnic area, and appreciate just how important it was that we follow Larry's direction in not only creating an intimate bowl, but that it not just be fixed seats, that there be places for people to mill around, that there be opportunities to watch the game while stretching your legs, again, hearkening back to some of these older parks. The flag court in right field is as popular as ever. Decades after opening, it's just a fun place to watch the game. We took advantage of the fact that this wall was 16 feet high and higher than in left field, and we brought the foul pole from Memorial Stadium with us so that even our foul poles are asymmetrical at Camden Yards. And again, just, you know, it's an opportunity to tell a story. The flags on this flag court hang in descending order of the team standings, so that any given day you can look out there and see where the Orioles rank compared to the other 29 teams. And in recent years, under Peter Angelos's leadership, I had a chance to go back and work for the Orioles to sort of do some gentle massaging for the 20th anniversary, and perhaps the most visible and my favorite of those projects was the bar that we added on top of the batter's eye that gives fans one of the most special advantages is in all of baseball, and one that's very similar to what the center field camera sees, so that now you've got a place where fans can go literally to see the game from 360 degrees around the park. There are a number of other little fun moments at Camden Yards that I hope if you have a chance to go, you find all these little photo moments. Don't think for a minute that these oversized bobbleheads were made just for little kids. They're made for big kids too. The concessions have gotten a refresh, and I think Delaware North, the concessionaire who was brought in for the 20th anniversary of the Orioles in 2012, did a particularly nice job of bringing in local fare, craft beer, French fries with Old Bay sauce, things that you could only find in Baltimore. And perhaps I appreciate more than most, since I do work outside the city, just how respected the Orioles are for both the ballpark and for the way the ballpark attracts fans with its food, its beverage, and a really fan-friendly presentation. There's been a lot of effort made over the years to stay current with the times. The Maryland Stadium Authority worked with us really closely 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago now, when we replaced the seats in the upper deck, recognizing that 48,000 now seems large compared to other ballparks. We reduced the capacity of Oriole Park at Camden Yards by putting in wider chairs on the upper deck, so that now not only do you have a more comfortable seat, but the building is sort of right-sized without changing the postcard view. There's several locations in the park where we took out the last few rows of seating and created drink rails and bar stools and a more casual way of watching the game. Ashton Design continued to work with the team 20 years later to add to the graphics and storytelling by bringing in fun pieces of material. And I wanted to end with perhaps a note that inevitably in Baltimore is a question is like, how has it aged? So this is a photograph of Utah Street in 1992, and here it is 20 years later. I think this photograph was taken probably for the 20th anniversary in 2012, which now seems dated. But of course, the biggest change isn't the ballpark, but it's the surrounding area. And while I'm often asked, how do I feel about the Hilton Hotel or the Zenith apartment buildings on the skyline, that was the whole point, was to move into downtown and be a part of the growth. And had we not been able to attract this kind of development, I don't think we would have been doing a very good job. So even though arguably the Bromo Seltzer Tower in this 1992 view from behind home plate adds much to the skyline, I'd have to say that this view, with the energy and the added bonus of an expanded convention center and all of the people who are now living and staying in hotels in this area, adds the energy that we sought when William Donald Schaefer chose this as a site, and when Jay Brody's BDC and Evans Paul's city planning department really advocated what this could be for downtown Baltimore. So it's been fun over the years to have conversations with Mayor Schmoke, who's now at the University of Baltimore, about all this has meant to the city of Baltimore and how it continues to be a point of pride, not only for the Orioles, but for the city and state. That's the end of my slides, and I'll turn it back to you for any comments, questions, reflections. I always enjoy learning from my audience, so I hope the Zoom forum will allow that opportunity to talk to.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jenna Marie. And again, everybody, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll take them in the order that that they arrive. I will say, while we're getting going, I have two quick questions. Bricks and bathrooms. I've heard stories about both, particularly the number of women's bathrooms. Do you mind? Is it true that there are the same number of men's and women's rooms? And was that a big deal? And
well, in hindsight, I guess it was a big deal. Today, it's kind of a nothing thing. Today, it's de rigueur. But I think perhaps in the 60s, 70s, there was an argument made that there were more men at sports facilities, and so there tended to be more men's restrooms or men's facilities within restrooms. By the time HOK designed Camden Yards, I think that had not only faded from political correctness, but it had faded from both practicality and from code perspective. So yes, there were as many women's restrooms as there were men's, and I think that's. I think the Orioles have really done a nice job of keeping those restrooms kind of current with the times as well. We often forget that Camden Yards was designed before ADA was embraced as part of code. There was a draft, and HOK worked very hard to conform to the draft that was on the table, but largely, even though ADA was adopted before the ribbon was cut at Camden Yards, it was designed and constructed before it was embraced. So I think that's another thing worth noting, is that the ballpark was really ahead of its time in terms of the way it addressed accessibility as well.
Excellent. All right, we got a couple rolling in here. So the first one is, have the players responded well to the stadium?
Well, I think they really have. I give Frank Robinson huge credit for that. Frank advocated with credibility this asymmetrical playing field, and in a way that no architect ever could, nor baseball executive. You know, Larry Lucchino and I both could go out on the road and talk about it all day long, but you put Frank Robinson out there to talk about asymmetry. Frank had played in these older parks. He'd played on that crazy terrace and its incline at Crossley Field in Cincinnati. You know, he was Frank Robinson, MVP in both leagues. And Frank, as manager, really wanted a park that would play fair. He wanted it to not be a hitter's park, not be a pitcher's park, but he understood the advantages of the intimacy of fans being close to the action with a small amount of foul territory, the asymmetrical playing field, and the benefit of players learning their home ballparks and knowing it better than the opposing team. And most importantly, Frank understood the energy that's derived from a fan base that's right on top of the action. And so I will always remember when Cal Ripken, who was playing on the team when we moved from Memorial Stadium to Camden Yards, his comment about walking onto the field, it felt like home. And I think that's a real testament to the composition that was put together by the stadium authority, the team, and the architectural forces led by HOK, RTKL, Bliss Nitre, and RK&K and Ashton.
Excellent. All right, we got a couple more here. If you've got a few minutes to hang in there with us.
I do. I need to get a sip of water. I've talked too much this morning. Hang on just one second.
You're allowed to do that. Next one was, can you go into the details of the mammoth Griffey Jr. home run? I confess I don't know what that is, but maybe you do.
Well, I know enough about it to speak to it. Ken Griffey Jr. is the only player who's ever hit the warehouse. And that was a home run during the home run derby of the 1993 All-Star game, the only one that Camden Yards has hosted. And that home run is marked by a star on the warehouse. So it's really kind of amazing for all the hundreds of home runs hit onto Utah Street marked by those bronze baseballs, that there's only one that's actually gone the extra 20 feet further to hit the warehouse. Johns, I wanted to back up to your question about how players responded. I'm sorry, I needed a sip of water before I could get to the second part of the answer. I wanted to say something about the clubhouse itself, because players respond not just to the playing field and to fans' reaction, but to their private areas. And again, Frank Robinson, as our manager, really led the design of the clubhouse. And it is a testament to its flexibility and its size, and HOK's understanding of the relationship of all of the different areas, the clubhouse, the training room, the weight room, the batting cages, that today it's still considered one of the best in the major league. And I remember when Buck Showalter was manager for the Orioles during the 20th anniversary, and Peter Angelos had me working on our spring training facility in Sarasota, and I worked really closely with Buck on the design of that and knew the way he wanted things done in the clubhouse. Mr. Angelos asked that we surprise him by implementing some of those changes in Baltimore, so that when the team came home from spring training in 2012, they would be greeted with a refresh of Camden Yards clubhouse that mirrored the things that Buck Showalter had asked for in spring training. And again, I think it's a testament to the flexibility of the building that it was able to absorb some of those changes, and that the Maryland Stadium Authority worked so closely with the Orioles to make that happen.
Excellent. Wow, what a surprise. All right, we got time for two more. We do try to keep these relatively right on time here, but we have a lament about whether there will ever be a team worthy of playing in such a magnificent stadium, but maybe we won't ask you to comment on that one, Jeremy.
I don't think I can comment on that. That's my area of expertise or influence.
But we do have a non-lament real question about, has safety netting caused any viewing issues?
You know, I think we got used to that a lot faster than anyone predicted. What the question is referring to, for those of you who aren't in the know, when Camden Yards opened, the tradition was to put netting for the seats right behind home plate, usually between the dugouts, so that you wouldn't get hit by a pop foul ball or a wayward pitch. And it was always considered sort of the blessing of being beyond the dugouts, that you didn't have to look through netting. But over the years, as the game has become more aggressive, and fans perhaps are watching their phones and not paying attention, and can't speak to the multitude of reasons. Maybe we're just a more litigious society, and it's caused teams to be more cautious. but MLB several years ago mandated that teams continue the netting generally down to the foul poles. It sort of varies because, as I said, every park is different. And I think at first we're like, oh, fans are going to hate it because it means you can't catch a home run ball in the same way if you're down the line, or a foul ball, or you can't get autographs. But I think we've quickly accepted the reality of that.
All right. All right. Final one. Do you feel there will be a further reduction in seating in the future? And do you have any ideas of what can be added to the stadium in place of the seats?
Well, there are two different approaches that teams have taken as buildings in the 90s have sought to consciously reduce their scale. One extreme would be what the Colorado Rockies did a few years ago when they took 5,000 seats out of their upper deck in right field and created a porch to watch the game in a very relaxed setting with just a bar and some cabanas and billiards tables. You know, the game is almost secondary. And then the other is a much more gentle approach, such as the one the Orioles took in 2012, where we simply widened the seats when they were replaced after 20 years with a wider seat so that they're evenly distributed, more comfortable for the fans, but you'd never know it was any different from the postcard view. I do think there's a possibility that the Orioles would want to go from 42,000 to a smaller number, though I'm not privy to any discussions on that. But in my work at Dodger Stadium, for those of you who are baseball geeks and watch it on television, or maybe you're lucky enough to have a chance to go, you'll see that our approach here has been a very gentle one, where we've taken out the last few rows of seating on every level and created standing room and better views for those fans who are in wheelchairs. And from a postcard view perspective, you'd never know we'd taken seats out while still retaining the capacity and creating more social areas at Dodger Stadium. So that would be the other way that the Orioles could approach that.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you again, Jenna Reed. That was great. One of the folks tuning in said that she fell in love with Baltimore even more after listening to your talk. I think that's I bet a lot of us will echo that. So
thank you.
So thank you, and thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And hopefully we will see you next week. All right, we're going to sign off.
Thank you for having me.
All right, have a good weekend, everybody.